Today we're looking at Genesis session number 6, the story of Isaac and Rebekah, which is recorded in Genesis chapter 24. We see a picture here that I want to have a little fun with you with this picture and ask you, what do you think is wrong with this picture? It's a pretty traditional painting or depiction of the servant of Abraham who was sent to find a wife for his son Isaac, and then prays to God for an answer to find the right person to be Isaac's wife. And we have Rebekah coming to the well to water the animals. But there is something wrong with this picture. And you might be surprised what it is. There are no camels in Genesis. That is what is wrong with that picture, because if you look back here, look at all the camels, and she's drawing water for camels. And we'll explain why this is an incorrect depiction. In an old article from the New York Times, there is this story called "Camels Had No Business in Genesis." And so I'm just going to summarize it briefly. And it says, camels probably had little or no role in the lives of such early Jewish patriarchs as Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, who lived in the first half of the second millennium BCE. And yet there are stories about them that mention domesticated pack animals more than 20 times. And the story of Genesis 24, for example, tells of Abraham's servant going by camel on a mission to find a wife for Isaac. And I'm going to skip down here until we find a little more proof. Well, let's see. Thought I had it highlighted, but maybe it is. It does show that there are no camels until much later, and this was proved by archaeologists who found the earliest cases of domesticated camels being around the 5th century BCE. So that would have been even after the time of King David. So here we are many years before, and for heaven's sake, why can I not find the highlighted section I had? That is how it goes when you're doing a recording, huh? Here we go. So the earliest known depiction of camels in Israel is the last third of the 10th century before current era. Many centuries after the patriarchs lived and decades after the kingdom of David, according to the Bible. Some bones in deeper sediments, the archaeologists said, probably belonged to wild camels that people had hunted for their meat. But domesticated camels, there are no indication of them until much later on, and they can tell this by the fact that the bones of the animals are deteriorated because of the heavy loads they were forced to carry. Anyway, so domesticated camels most likely didn't have any reason to be inside of the stories of Genesis, but it's just kind of a fun thing to find out. So if we look at a timeline, this can help you understand also, just for the fun of it. The patriarchs are living in 2300 BCE up through the time of about 1800 BCE. And then we have the time that the descendants of Jacob are in Egypt. And King David is not until way over here under the United Kingdom around 1000 BCE. So it's quite a long time before we actually have domesticated camels. So think of donkeys anytime you see a camel depicted in this time period, it is most likely a donkey because they were the common pack animal and occasionally mules. All right, getting back to our topic for today, the life of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac's story is more of a transitional story. It's more of a preparation for setting up the future generations of patriarchs that come after him. Chapter 24 gives us a detailed story of finding a proper wife for Isaac before Abraham passes. The servant is probably Eliezer, who was mentioned earlier when Abraham spoke to God and was as saying that he had no heir, and that Eliezer his servant would be his heir. So this may be the same person. Even though he's not mentioned by name, he was a trusted servant. So the servant took an oath to find a wife for Isaac. And the longest narrative in Genesis is the commission to find a wife for Isaac. So it's the longest story. It's a type of story. It's written in a style that repeats it from several different points of view. So you have repetition after repetition within the chapter of 24, which tells about the story. And it's a literary technique that was used in ancient times. And people understood this literary technique. So let's have a look at this and see what it tells us about Isaac. This particular video does not show a person. It is only an audio, just so you know.
These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. They are produced by the Teaching Company. These lectures are titled The Book of Genesis, Part 2. Lecture 13, Genesis 24, A Bride for Isaac.
Genesis 24 is the longest prose narrative in the Torah, or Pentateuch. There's one chapter that's longer, Numbers chapter 7, but that's a long list of items. This is the longest narrative story that we have in the 5 books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And we're going to read this story in detail, another close reading of a biblical story. Before that, I want to address some of the larger issues, however. The main point of this story is Abraham sending his servant to the homeland, to the traditional family homeland of Aram, to obtain a bride for Isaac. The first question we must ask, however, is why cannot Isaac go himself? The answer is that the promise of offspring and the promise of the land of Canaan were linked together in God's words to Abraham as far back as chapter 12, the first time that God spoke to Abraham. He promised him offspring, and he promised him the land of Canaan. Accordingly, Isaac cannot leave the land, not even to procure his own bride, and thus a surrogate must go to Aram, the family homeland in northern Mesopotamia, to find the bride, who, as we shall see, turns out to be Rebekah. I further want to note, as an aside, that in the stories of Genesis, Abram's name is changed to Abraham. And that's something we already read in Genesis chapter 17. And Jacob's name is changed to Israel. We haven't read that yet. That occurs twice, actually. We find 2 examples of that in Genesis 32 and again in Genesis 35. Abram's name changed to Abraham. Jacob's name changed to Israel. Isaac's name, however, remains Isaac throughout. He does not get his name changed. Why? The reason for this is that he was named by God. If you look at Genesis chapter 17, verse 19, you will see that it was God who instructed Abraham what he should call the son to be born by Sarah, Isaac. Note further that the author does not disclose either of these 2 points to his readers explicitly. We never get a statement as to why Isaac cannot leave the land. We never get a statement to the effect that Isaac's name was not changed. That is not the style of writing in the Bible. The reader must determine these 2 points on his or her own, wondering why it is that Isaac cannot do his own work when it comes to finding a bride. And if the question should even enter the mind of the reader must figure out why Isaac alone, among the 3 patriarchs, does not undergo a name change. The main point is, as we have noted on several occasions, and as we will continue to note throughout this course, that the narrative demands reader input. The author does not provide everything for the reader. Consistent with this narrative style is the very economical writing style in the Bible. We've talked about all these points throughout our course thus far. Genesis 24, on the other hand, represents a departure from the norm that I have just described, because, as I indicated at the outset, it is such a long story, the longest narrative chapter in the Torah, to repeat the information which we presented at the beginning of this lecture. Why is it such a long story? The main reason for its great length, for the great length of this chapter, is the repetition that occurs throughout. This itself, repetition, is a literary device, another literary device in the long list of devices that we are building throughout this course. And it invites the reader to compare the different tellings of the story. We get Abraham telling his servant what he's supposed to do. We get the servant going to Aram and the narrative telling us exactly what happens. And then we get the servant telling the family of Rebekah what has transpired. So there are going to be 3 tellings, what we might call the command, the fulfillment, and the retelling. Abraham commands the servant what to do, the fulfillment of the mission, he does what he was instructed to do, and then the retelling of it as he tells Rebekah's family all that has occurred. 3 tellings, in some cases, as we'll see, actually 4 tellings of the storyline. That repetition is typical of biblical style, but what's important here is that the repetition is not verbatim. It is never verbatim. There are always slight changes in the wording, and in this way, the story writer invites the reader to pay strict attention, close attention to the different wordings, and to compare the words that Abraham would have spoken to the servant with actually what happens, and then when the servant retells the story. And we're going to spend a lot of time in this lecture looking at those verses very closely, comparing the wording between telling A, telling B, telling C, between the command, the fulfillment, and the retelling of it. First, a major note before we get to some of those minor details. There are 2 sons of Abraham, you'll recall. There is Ishmael, born to Hagar, and there's Isaac, born to Sarah. 4 things have already happened in Ishmael's life. The first is what we'll call the Annunciation, that is, God telling Hagar that she would have a son. That doesn't quite happen to Ishmael per se, it happens more to his mother Hagar, but we'll call that the Annunciation. That's the technical word which describes the message from the deity to the mother that she is pregnant or will become pregnant with a child. We then have the birth of Ishmael. Both of those were narrated in Genesis 16. We then have a near-death experience of Ishmael. In Genesis 21, you'll remember that he was out in the desert with his mother Hagar, and they ran out of water until God showed Hagar where to find water in the desert. And then finally, at the end of chapter 21, we've learned that Ishmael married. So there are the 4 things: the Annunciation, that is the expectation of his birth, the birth itself, a near-death experience, and his marriage. With Isaac, the second son of Abraham, the child of Sarah, 3 of these things have already occurred. There's been the Annunciation. You'll recall, again, the angels who come to visit Abraham and inform Abraham and Sarah that she will have a child. The birth of Isaac, that occurs in Genesis 21 at the beginning of that chapter. A near-death experience, the Akedah. We devoted an entire lecture to reading that story where Isaac was bound on the altar. And so if the pattern of Ishmael's life and the pattern of Isaac's life are parallel, which they are, we expect a 4th item, a 4th piece of the puzzle, and that is a marriage for Isaac as well. And so the reader's expectations are there that indeed Isaac also will get married. And that's what Genesis 24 is. But of course, there's always much more information about Isaac than there is about Ishmael. That is to say, the annunciation to Sarah is narrated in a longer fashion than it is to Hagar. The much more is made of the birth of Isaac than is made of the birth of Ishmael. The near-death experience, it's told about Ishmael, but even more so in the story of the Akedah, Genesis 22 about Isaac. And similarly, the marriage of Ishmael took only one verse in Genesis 21. It will be a very, very long chapter, as we've indicated here in Genesis chapter 24. In verse 2 of this story, Genesis 24, verse 2, Abraham asks his servant, or commands his servant, to swear that he will go to the land of Aram and obtain a bride for Isaac. And he does this, but he does it by, Abraham tells him in verse 2, put your hand under my thigh. And after the long speech of Abraham, the long dialogue between Abraham and his servant, in verse 9, the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him. Now, what does it mean to put your hand under the thigh? Apparently, this is a euphemism that actually what the servant does was to touch, hold, or take hold, or touch Abraham's testicles. This was a way of swearing, of doing an oath. And in fact, if we look at our own English language, we note that the word testicle is related to the word testimony and testify. These all come from the same Latin root. Historians of the Latin language are unsure of the origin of this connection, but it appears that in ancient Rome, the same custom occurred, and therefore testicles came to be known as testicles because that was where you testify. That's you took hold under the thigh, to use the biblical euphemism. That occurs one other time in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 48. Those are our only two occurrences, in our story and again in Genesis 48, in a scene between Jacob and Joseph. The next point to note in our story is that the servant is anonymous. We are not given his
All right, I hope that you found that interesting, a little explanation of the narrative, but we had a good giggle in class about how the word testify and testimony came to be and what it means to take an oath in the Old Testament or ancient world times. So I hope you get a giggle out of it too. So moving on then, and the next slide here. Isaac, then once we have read the story of Isaac and Rebekah's meeting, we see that Isaac brought her into his mother's tent, thus establishing her at once in the rights and honors of a wife before he had even seen her features. In ancient times, disappointments often took place, but when Isaac saw his wife, it is said that he loved her. So the acquisition of Rebekah into the family of Abraham, and Sarah has passed away, so Rebekah will be the new matriarch who replaces Sarah as the maternal family figure. She, and then as Abraham passed away, she and Isaac are now the paternal and maternal head of the family. The covenant promises and the blessings that were given to Isaac will now, or I'm sorry, given to Abraham will now pass on to the next generation of Isaac and Rebekah. And you can find that in Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 through 6. And Isaac and Rebekah faced the same problems that Sarah and Abraham faced of infertility. So let's take a look at what happens here. This is the account of the family of Isaac, written in chapter 25 of Genesis. He is the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, from Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean. Now, so she is his cousin. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife. because she was unable to have children. And the Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. It says, but the two children struggled with each other in her womb. So she went to ask the Lord about this. Why is it happening to me? She asked. And the Lord told her, the sons in your womb will become two different nations. From the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat. So they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. And then we figured out that Isaac lived approximately 180 years. So here we have a little picture of Jacob and Esau. Delightful little boys. So probably this is the condition that Esau had, if it was as recorded. Hypertrichosis is what he might have had. It is an abnormal amount of hair growth over the body. The two distinct types of hypertrichosis are generalized hypertrichosis, where hair occurs over the entire body, or there is localized trichosis, where it is restricted to a certain area of the body. That might be what he had according to the description in Genesis 25:25. And continuing on, chapter 26 seems to be a story that is recounted or retold, similar to a story that was told earlier in Genesis 21 about Abraham. So this is about Isaac. And so either the author of Genesis, it is two different authors that may have told this story, or it is that it was a retelling. But then there's also the possibility that there was another Abimelech who was a generation or two later who was given the same name. We always have clues that sorry, I lost my page here. We always seem to have clues that these stories are written much later, after the fact. So one of them is repeated several times throughout is the appearance of the Philistines, who did not live in this area of Canaan or along the coast of the Mediterranean until about 1200 BCE. And that would be, as you remember, like the story of King David when he's a boy fighting with Goliath, that happened with the Philistines. So we know this is much later event than what is recorded here. Three things would come to mind here as we're going through this lesson. When in the life of Isaac, at the beginning of the marriage between he and Rebekah after Abraham passes away, we see the repeat of a famine. And we know that in Abraham, a couple times in his life, there were famines as part of a cycle of the climate in the area of the Mediterranean region where it is dry. So the people would oftentimes go to Egypt, which would have a surplus of food because they were able to irrigate along the Nile River. The famine cycle is repeated, but this time, instead of going to Egypt, we have Isaac commanded not to go to Egypt, but to remain in an area called Gerar. Isaac was given the generational promise of blessings. He would have descendants, land, and he would struggle for it. And that's in chapter 26, verses 2-7. And he was told, directed by God, to remain in Canaan, but to live there as a foreigner. This is probably a little bit difficult to see, but you can see on here what Israel looked like in ancient times. And you can also see the main routes that were traveled by the red dotted lines. Those would have been main roads of this period of time. And the Philistines were said to have lived all along the coast. And that is when they did arrive later. And this is the area of Gerar where Isaac was commanded to stay. And we had this incident with the king, with Abimelech over water rights. And so a wadi would be an area where it's hilly and there'd be like a gully or a gap in between, and water would collect and gather, and there would oftentimes be springs in there, so they were a main source of water. And Isaac, of course, with his flocks of animals, would need to have water. I'd like to take a look at Isaac, the individual, as a person. When you think back on Isaac's life, he's different than the other patriarchs in a number of ways. We don't have a lot of information about him, like we do about Abraham, and then later about Jacob and his son. So we have the story of Isaac and the binding when Abraham takes him to offer him as a sacrifice. We know that he prayed for children for his wife Rebecca to become pregnant. And we have several references to Isaac when he is on his deathbed or when he's old and blind. But what about the rest of his life? He did live a long time. So kind of think about Isaac as an individual and put yourself in his place, in his shoes, so to speak, for a moment. As a youth, he had had a near-death experience at the hands of his father. And imagine how that would affect someone psychologically. The relationship between Isaac and Abraham doesn't seem to have ever recovered from that. Isaac grieved for his mother, Sarah. But then later, there is no indication that he grieved for his father at his death. It says that Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham, but little other information is given beyond that they buried him in the same tomb as Sarah and then went their separate ways. So Isaac and the blessing. In Genesis 26, verses 23-25, it says, "From there Isaac moved to Beersheba, where the Lord appeared to him on the night of his arrival. 'I am the God of your father Abraham,' he said. 'Do not be afraid, for I am with you and will bless you. I will multiply your descendants, and they will become a great nation. I will do this because of my promise to Abraham, my servant.' Then Isaac built an altar there and worshiped the Lord. He set up his camp at that place, and his servants dug another well." So the sentence that stood out for me was, "I will do this because of my promise to Abraham, my servant." The blessing does pass on, the blessing for land and descendants, and the promise is there. But God is telling Isaac it's because of his father Abraham that he's giving him the blessing, not because of anything Isaac himself is doing. So even the blessing to Isaac seems to be for the sake of his father rather than for himself. We saw or heard a little of this in the video earlier, a little comparison of Isaac and Ishmael. Both of them had their births announced by angels. Both have a near-death experience early on in their life that was caused by their father. Ishmael thrived and had strong tribal descendants, whereas Isaac seemed to struggle for heirs. Isaac seemed rather weak. He was portrayed on his sick bed a number of times throughout the book of Genesis. Ishmael and the other sons of Abraham. Ishmael was technically the firstborn son of Abraham. He seemed to have rebounded from his near-death experience and he prospered. And the other sons of Abraham that he had through his concubines and his second wife, Keturah, were harshly sent away and became oppositional to the Israelites. So we wonder, why doesn't Abraham have a better relationship with Isaac, who is the heir to the blessings and the promise that God had given him? Some other thoughts that come to mind also when I think about Abraham's character. Why didn't Abraham argue with God to save Isaac when he took him for the offering or the binding? He had argued for Lot and for the people in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So why not argue for the life of Isaac rather than offering him as a sacrifice? So why was Isaac so compliant about going to be a sacrifice with an animal? Why did he go with his father? He was probably old enough to protest, although I know cultural differences may have made that an impossibility. And why was it a 3-day journey to an unknown place? So why was the sacrifice so far away from home? And then I also want to point out, how did Sarah feel about this whole event? There's no mention of the law of God that forbade human and child sacrifice, yet we know way back in a lesson 2 or 3 times ago, we read about the laws of against child sacrifice. And it makes you wonder and ponder over the whole story and how Isaac's life was impacted by all of these events. And so I'll leave you with a lot of thoughts about why, I wonder, and how did, this whole story of the life of Abraham impact his son Isaac. So suggested reading for the next 3 weeks, chapters 27 through 36, the stories of Isaac, Esau, and Jacob. So we have Isaac now, we'll still follow through to the stories of Esau and Jacob. And if you're really feeling adventurous and have time on your hands, you can read all the way through the end of chapter 50 of Genesis to the end of the book. And I'll see you next week for lesson 7.